The city glittered beneath the night sky, its towers gleaming like jagged teeth of glass and steel. Alexander Cross stepped from his armored sedan, his black overcoat catching the faint drizzle as he strode toward the restaurant's entrance. The valet didn't dare meet his eyes. Few men ever did. Cross was a titan of industry, the billionaire architect of a technology empire that stretched across continents. Entire economies shifted when he raised his hand, and governments bent when he lowered it. He was not a man accustomed to waiting, and the world, by and large, had learned that truth. Inside the restaurant, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of seared meat and rich sauces. Crystal chandeliers dripped light over polished tables, and every chair was filled with someone important enough to be seen, yet none so powerful as the man who had just entered. Conversations dropped to murmurs as Alexander crossed the room with the certainty of one who owned not just wealth but destiny. His stride carried the arrogance of victory, as if the world itself was merely the next acquisition waiting to be folded into his portfolio. Marcus Lee, head waiter for the evening, caught sight of him immediately. Marcus was a tall man, shoulders square from years of discipline, his dark eyes quick and watchful. Unlike his younger staff, he did not flinch at Alexander's presence, though he felt the ripple it caused through the dining hall. To serve a man like Alexander Cross required precision, not just in service, but in demeanor. Marcus had trained his staff to anticipate needs, to remain invisible until required, and to show deference without becoming sycophants. But tonight, Marcus sensed a tension beneath the surface, a whisper of something that unsettled the usual rhythm. Alexander took his seat at the private table reserved for him, sliding into the leather chair as though it were a throne. His guest of the evening, Vincent Hale, was already there, a sharp-eyed investor with a smile that was both charming and predatory. Hale greeted him with the familiarity of equals, though in truth, few men could ever stand level with Alexander Cross. Their conversation began with clipped efficiency, projected mergers, hostile takeovers, the movements of competitors. Every sentence was a transaction, every word a weapon. Marcus directed his team with subtle gestures, ensuring the wine was poured, the bread served, the timing flawless. Among the staff, a young server moved nervously, his hands trembling as he carried a polished tray. Marcus's gaze sharpened. He had seen the boy unsettled before, but tonight the tension seemed different. Something clutched at the younger man's chest, some weight pressing him down. Marcus made a note to intervene if needed. The order was placed. Alexander demanded the finest cut, seared precisely to his preference. To him, food was not sustenance but a declaration of status. He ate only the best, drank only the rarest, lived only at the peak. Anything less was an insult to his place in the world. When the steak arrived, it was set before him with practiced grace. The plate gleamed, the meat seared to perfection, a jewel of culinary art. Yet alongside it, almost unnoticed, was something else, a folded slip of paper tucked beneath the edge. Marcus, watching from across the room, caught the motion. The young server had placed it there, quick as a thief, and retreated before Alexander's eyes could fall. Alexander was too absorbed in his discussion with Hale to notice at first. He cut into the steak, spoke of market shares and hostile strategies, his words weaving the future of industries. But as the candlelight shifted, the faint corner of the folded note caught his attention. He paused, knife hovering mid-cut, and plucked it from the plate. Hale continued talking, unaware, but Marcus watched closely. Alexander unfolded the paper with a flick of his fingers, expecting perhaps a message from the chef or some trivial mistake. Instead, his eyes locked on the words scrawled in dark ink. His face stilled. The room did not notice, but Marcus did. The faint tremor at the corner of his mouth, the way his gaze sharpened as though stabbed by something unexpected. Alexander's expression, usually carved from stone, cracked ever so slightly. Hale noticed nothing, absorbed in his own ambition, but Alexander was no longer listening. The words on the note had pierced the armor of the most ruthless man in the room. Marcus, standing silently by, felt the shift ripple outward. He did not know what the note contained, but he knew its weight. Something had struck Alexander Cross in a place untouched by wealth, by power, by all the conquests of his life. Alexander folded the note again, sliding it into his jacket pocket with a movement too deliberate to be casual. His mind was elsewhere now, though his voice continued a performance of conversation. Hale was speaking of profits and expansion, but Alexander's responses were curt, distracted. For the first time in years, he looked less like a king at feast and more like a man caught off guard in unfamiliar terrain. Marcus poured the wine with steady hands, his expression neutral, but his thoughts churned. He had seen many men shaken in this room. Bankers broken by losses, politicians undone by scandal. But Alexander Cross was not like other men. To see him falter, even for a heartbeat, was a glimpse of something rare, dangerous, and utterly human. The dinner wound on, the note burning like a hidden ember in Alexander's pocket. Hale eventually excused himself, satisfied enough with the evening's outcome, though perhaps unsettled by a companion's uncharacteristic detachment. When the investor was gone, Alexander sat alone for a moment, staring at the half-finished steak, his jaw tight. Marcus approached quietly, offering the bill with his usual professional calm. As Alexander signed without looking, his eyes flicked up, locking onto Marcus with an intensity that froze the air between them. For the briefest instant, Alexander seemed on the verge of speaking, of demanding answers, but he said nothing. He rose, straightened his jacket, and walked out into the night, the folded note pressing against his chest like a stone. Marcus watched him leave, his mind unsettled. Whatever message had been delivered, it had struck deep, and Marcus knew with certainty that the story was only beginning. The limousine carried Alexander through the midnight streets, but his thoughts were not in the city. The note lay in his pocket like a live ember, its words etched into his mind. Asterisk, you don't remember me, but I remember you. You ruined my father's life. Asterisk's empire had made him untouchable, or so he believed, yet this scrap of paper reached places that no hostile takeover or boardroom betrayal ever had. He replayed the handwriting, the curve of the letters, the sting of those final words. They were not a threat. They were a judgment. In the silence of the car, he let his mind drift back. Faces blurred together from the years of conquest. Executives broken, rivals crushed, entire companies devoured by his hunger for dominance. He had always told himself it was necessary, the price of greatness. But one face emerged more clearly than the rest, a man who had stood against him when few dared. David Johnson. He had been no titan, no magnate, just a mid-level executive who tried to fight when Alexander targeted his company for acquisition. Johnson had spoken boldly at the shareholders' meeting, condemning Crosstech as ruthless tactics. Alexander had admired his defiance, in a way, but admiration did not spare him. The merger had gone through. Johnson was cast out, and whispers of scandal, carefully seated by Alexander's team, ensured no one would hire him again. Alexander closed his eyes. That had been 20 years ago, maybe more. He had not thought of Johnson in years, yet now the man's ghost pressed against him, summoned by a note in a restaurant. The next day brought no relief. In his office atop the glass tower that bore his name, Alexander moved through meetings with the detachment of a man elsewhere. Charts and projections blurred before him. Subordinates chattered like insects, and every so often his hand strayed unconsciously to his pocket, touching the folded paper. His executives sensed something off, though none dared ask. The Titan appeared distracted, and that was enough to make even the boldest of them uneasy. When the sun set again, Alexander made a decision. He returned to the restaurant, not with investors or partners, but alone. The maitre d', startled by his sudden appearance, ushered him in at once. The staff glanced at him in muted surprise. It was rare to see a man like him without an entourage. Marcus Lee was there, as always, directing the floor with quiet authority. When Alexander's eyes found him, there was no mistaking the intent. Marcus approached, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable. "You wish to dine again, sir?" Marcus asked smoothly. "No," Alexander said, his voice lower than usual, carrying the edge of command but lacking its usual certainty. "I want to know who left the note." For a moment Marcus said nothing. His gaze held steady, neither deferential nor defiant, but calm. Perhaps it is not the author that matters, but the message. Alexander's jaw tightened. "I am not a man who entertains riddles. Bring me the one who wrote it." Marcus hesitated, then inclined his head slightly. The message was not intended to humiliate or expose you. It was placed there because debts, especially those written in the lives of others, do not vanish with time. You should already know the name. The silence between them lengthened. Alexander's heart gave a dull thud, though his face betrayed nothing. Johnson, he said at last, the word more exhaled than spoken. Marcus's eyes flickered with something. Recognition, perhaps sorrow, but he gave no nod. My father carried his principles to his grave. He would not bow, even when it cost him everything. You, Mr. Cross, ensured that cost. The impact landed heavier than the note had. Alexander studied Marcus, finally seeing not just a waiter, but a man bound by history to a choice he himself had made long ago. The resemblance was faint, but it was there, in the eyes, in the unyielding composure. Marcus Johnson, son of the man he had destroyed. Alexander leaned back, slightly, as if struck. So it was you. The note was yours. It was mine to deliver, Marcus corrected quietly, but not mine to write. My father left it behind before he died. He knew, one day, fate would place you within reach again. He told me to carry it, and when the moment came, to let you remember. Alexander felt something twist in his chest, something dangerously close to regret. He remembered David Johnson's voice at that meeting, clear, passionate, condemning the greed that consumed men like Cross. At the time, Alexander had laughed it off, a moral sermon from a man too weak to survive. But now, looking into the eyes of Johnson's son, he felt the weight of that defiance anew. Marcus's voice cut through his thoughts. You've built an empire on the ruin of others. Perhaps that is the nature of business, as you see it. But there is a cost, Mr. Cross, not measured in dollars, but in dignity. My father bore that cost until it broke him. Alexander's reply came sharp, defensive. Do you imagine your father was the only one? This is how the world works. If not me, another would have taken him down. I did what was necessary. Marcus's gaze hardened, though his voice remained steady. There is always another way. But you chose a path of fire because it made you stronger. Do not mistake inevitability for choice. The words stung because they rang true. Alexander had prided himself on choosing ruthlessness. He had worn it like armor, wielded it like a blade. Now, in this quiet confrontation, the armor seemed thin. A long silence followed, heavy with all that was unsaid. The clinking of cutlery and murmurs of diners faded into the background, leaving only the two men at the center of something larger than the walls around them. Finally, Marcus spoke again, softer now. The note was not meant to destroy you. It was meant to remind you. My father wanted you to know that the lives you step on do not simply vanish. They live in memory, in consequence, in the sons who remember. Alexander swallowed, the words sticking in his throat. He had faced hostile boards, political inquiries, even assassination attempts from rivals abroad. None had pierced him like this. He had never cared what men thought of him once they were beaten. But to see the legacy of one he had crushed still standing before him, it unsettled the very foundation of his certainty. Marcus inclined his head slightly, the faintest gesture of closure. I've said what needed saying. The rest is for you to carry. With that, he turned back to the duties of his station, leaving Alexander alone at the table, the folded note still heavy in his pocket. The billionaire sat in silence long after Marcus had gone, staring at the untouched glass of wine before him. He could not drink. He could not think of profits or markets. Only the memory of David Johnson's voice, echoing through decades, rising now in the eyes of his son. When he finally stood, his movements were slower, less certain. For the first time in his life, Alexander Cross felt the ground beneath him shift. Not from defeat, but from the weight of truth. And as he left the restaurant, the city's glow seemed dimmer, the night colder. The game he had mastered, so completely no longer felt like victory. It felt like debt, and he knew with grim certainty that the story was far from over. Alexander Cross could not escape the words. No matter how many hours he buried himself in contracts or how many board meetings he dominated with ruthless precision, the memory of Marcus's calm stare gnawed at him. It was not rage or desperation that unsettled him. It was the quiet weight of truth carried in the younger man's voice. Alexander had spent his entire career believing that the world rewarded strength and punished weakness. Now, the ghost of David Johnson, embodied in his son, lingered as evidence that destruction left echoes far beyond the ledger. 3 nights later, Alexander returned to the steakhouse once more. This time he asked for a private room. Marcus appeared at the door after the last guest had left, his posture as composed as ever, though his eyes carried the wary sharpness of a man who expected confrontation. "You summoned me," Marcus said evenly. Alexander's hand rested on a crystal glass, though he had not touched the drink. "I did. Sit." Marcus hesitated, then obeyed, lowering himself into the chair opposite the billionaire. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. "I've faced rivals with armies of lawyers and governments armed with regulators," Alexander began, his voice quieter than his usual commanding tone. "None of them unsettle me the way you have. That note, it pierced deeper than I expected, perhaps deeper than I'd like to admit." Marcus studied him. "It wasn't meant to threaten you. My father never believed in revenge. He only wanted you to remember that men are not pawns to be discarded. He hoped that one day you would see that for yourself." Alexander let out a short, bitter laugh. "And yet he was crushed. My company grew stronger. His life unraveled, and his family bore the cost. Is that supposed to be justice?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Justice is not always measured in balance sheets. It is measured in what survives. My father's dignity endured until the end. He chose to resist, even when it destroyed him. That matters more than the empire you built on his ashes." The words landed with a force Alexander could not deflect. For years he had told himself that Johnson's downfall was inevitable, a casualty of progress. But Marcus's conviction made that defense feel hollow. He remembered the look in David's eyes during their last encounter. Not fear, not even despair, but grim certainty that he had chosen principle over surrender. At the time, Alexander had mocked it as futility. Now he saw it for what it was, defiance that outlived the man himself. Alexander leaned forward, his voice harder. "Do you think I built all this by playing fair? The world doesn't reward idealists. Your father's courage, his dignity, it changed nothing." Marcus did not flinch. "You're wrong. It changed me. I watched him refuse to compromise what he believed, even as everything else was taken. That gave me strength to stand in front of you now. You remember him. That means he's still here, haunting your victories. That means he won something you'll never erase." The billionaire fell silent, his gaze narrowing. He had expected anger, expected a plea for restitution, or perhaps blackmail. Instead, Marcus offered something far more dangerous, truth unvarnished, without fear. For a long while neither man spoke. The ticking of the antique clock on the wall punctuated the quiet, a reminder of time's relentless passage. Alexander's fingers tapped once against the glass, then stilled. "I remember your father," Alexander admitted finally, the words reluctant but undeniable. "I remember the fire in his voice, the way he stood against me when everyone else folded. I admired him, even as I destroyed him. And yes, I knew what my lies would do to him. I did it anyway, because I wanted to win." Marcus's eyes hardened. "And did you win?" Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, he did not have an immediate answer. His wealth was immeasurable, his influence unmatched. Yet in this moment, facing the son of man he had buried, he felt strangely hollow. Marcus rose slowly, his expression neither triumphant nor vengeful, but resolute. "My father didn't ask me to fight you. He only asked me to remind you. Whatever you do with that reminder is yours to carry. But understand this, Mr. Cross. Power built on ruin will always tremble when confronted by memory." Alexander looked up at him, the words striking like a hammer against the iron walls he had built around his conscience. "You think you've undone me with a single note?" "No," Marcus said simply. "Only you can undo yourself." He turned toward the door, leaving Alexander alone in the dimly lit room. The billionaire stared after him, a storm brewing behind his eyes. He had expected a confrontation of fury, of demands, of bargaining. Instead, he had been left with something far more unbearable. The quiet certainty that perhaps, for all his conquests, he had been the one truly conquered. The night pressed close around the windows as Alexander finally rose. His reflection in the glass showed a man of power, but in his eyes he saw cracks he could no longer ignore. Marcus's words echoed in the silence. Only you can undo yourself. For the first time in decades, Alexander Cross felt a question stir within him. Not about profit, not about strategy, but about the very nature of the life he had built. And though he did not yet know the answer, he knew one thing with certainty. He could not return to who he had been before the note. The story that began with a stake and a folded slip of paper was not finished. It was only just beginning. The city stretched out beneath Alexander's penthouse like a glittering circuit board, every light a reminder of the empire he had built. Yet for the first time in his life, the sight filled him not with pride, but with disquiet. He sat in the darkened room, the note unfolded once more in his hands, its edges worn soft from his constant handling. He had tried to bury himself in the machinery of power, but the words lingered like a wound that refused to close. Asterisk, you don't remember me. But I remember you. You ruined my father's life. Asterisk. The more he thought of David Johnson, the more the man's defiance rose in his memory. A lone figure standing against a tide of wealth and ruthlessness, his voice unwavering even as he was dragged under. Alexander had admired that courage once, but admiration had not stayed his hand. Now haunted him, a ghost that no fortune could silence. He had always believed victory erased the past. Marcus had proven him wrong. He pressed his palms into his face, as if he could smother the storm building inside. His wealth had bought him silence, obedience, fear, but not respect. Not truly. Respect built on fear was fragile, and now he saw it for the illusion it was. He thought of the employees cast aside during his rises, of the families who bore the cost of his ambition. He had dismissed them as casualties of war, faceless numbers on a balance sheet. But Marcus's eyes had forced those numbers into flesh and blood. At dawn, he sat before a mirror, staring at a reflection he no longer recognized. The face was the same, sharp features, steel gray eyes, the countenance of a man others bowed to, but behind the eyes he saw cracks. He was not untouchable. He was not invincible, and for the first time, he asked himself if power had been worth the price. The shareholders' meeting arrived 2 weeks later. The great hall buzzed with voices, every seat filled with men who measured worth only in profits. They expected Alexander to deliver his usual speech: domination, expansion, record-breaking gains. They did not expect what came. He stood at the podium, his hand steady though his heart was uncharacteristically heavy. For years, he began, his voice carrying to the chamber, I have told you that success requires sacrifice. That ruthlessness is the price of survival. And I have led this company with that philosophy, unapologetically. Many of you have grown wealthy because of it. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Alexander's eyes swept over them, seeing their greed mirrored back. But I have come to see the truth, he continued, his voice sharpening. Sacrifice has always meant others paying the price for our victories. We measure lives in quarterly reports, families in profit margins. And in doing so, we have become hollow. A stir of unease spread. One board member leaned toward another, whispering urgently. Alexander pressed forward. There was a man named David Johnson. Some of you may not remember him, but I do. He stood against me when I sought to consume the company he loved. He lost everything because of me. I told myself it was necessary, that the world rewarded only the strong. But strength without honor is nothing more than corruption. His voice has echoed in my memory these past weeks, reminding me of what we have become. The room erupted in confusion. Some demanded explanations, others scoffed, calling it weakness. But Alexander silenced them with a single raised hand, the same commanding gesture that had bent markets and crushed rivals. I will no longer lead by ruin, he declared. From this day forward, Crosstech will fund initiatives to rebuild the communities we have stripped bare. We will invest in those we left behind. And the first of these will be the Johnson Foundation, a scholarship and relief trust named for the man whose dignity outlasted my greed. The board exploded with outrage. Voices rose in fury. Accusations of betrayal filled the hall. But Alexander stood unmoved, a storm breaking in his chest, his words like steel. You can replace me if you wish. But know this, the world is watching. They have feared us for our ruthlessness. Let them now respect us for our humanity. If I must fall for that to happen, so be it. The meeting ended in chaos, but the announcement spread like wildfire through the financial world. Some called it madness, others genius. For the first time, Alexander's name was spoken not only with fear, but with reluctant admiration. Days later, he returned to the restaurant. Marcus was there, as if waiting, his posture unchanged, his eyes steady as ever. Alexander approached, holding a document bound in leather. He placed it on the table between them. The Johnson Foundation, he said simply, funded from my personal fortune. Scholarships, housing support, opportunities for families destroyed by men like me. It will bear your father's name, not mine. Marcus studied him in silence, searching for insincerity. Finally, he nodded once, slowly. It won't bring him back. I know, Alexander said, but perhaps it will keep others from suffering the same fate. A long silence stretched between them. For the first time, Alexander did not look like a man untouchable, but like one who had chosen to bear a weight he could never set down. Marcus's voice was quiet when he spoke again. You've taken a step my father never believed you capable of. Maybe there's something left in you worth salvaging. Alexander met his gaze. I don't seek forgiveness, only to remember. To change before the end writes me off as it did him. Marcus inclined his head, not with forgiveness, but with acknowledgement. That, Alexander realized, was more than he deserved. When he left the restaurant, the night air felt different. Colder, sharper, yet somehow cleaner. The note still lay in his pocket, but it no longer burned. It rested there as a reminder, a weight he would carry until his last breath. He looked out over the city, its endless towers gleaming in the dark. Once, they had seemed like monuments to his power. Now, they looked like fragile glass, each one built on the backs of men like David Johnson. Alexander Cross walked into the night, no longer the unassailable titan, but man remade by a single note and the memory of one he had destroyed. His empire might endure or crumble, but he knew one truth with unshakable certainty. Legacy was not built in wealth or conquest. It was built in the lives one chose to honor. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Cross chose to honor more than himself.